Hi folks, my name is Mike Dobbs and welcome back to another edition of Government Matters. It's my pleasure and privilege today to welcome back to our studios Congressman Richard Neal. Thank you.
Glad to be with you, Mike.
Boy, do I have a lot to talk about with you.
There's a lot to talk about.
Okay, so let's talk about what's happening in the House. With the changeover of leadership, I think the biggest concern that many of us have had is what is going to happen to the president's agenda, to more key legislation. And let's just start there. How are things working out in the House, and do you think that we're going to see more progress made toward allocating funds to things that really need money, to attacking issues that need to be resolved? Give me a temperature taking here of what's going on.
Well, we've had 4 years in the Democratic leadership of really extraordinary success with legislation. And the context of those achievements, I think, sometimes are underreported. But when you consider whether it was the CARES Act, which saved the American economy, the renegotiation of USMCA, the CHIPS Act, the infrastructure bill, those come to mind immediately. And I think now we're headed toward more of an impasse. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most important and consequential piece of legislation addressing climate change that's ever happened. There has been an effort as recently as just a couple of days ago on the Republican side to undo many of those achievements, while simultaneously many of their stalwart supporters are applying for the tax credits. There's more than a little bit of irony there, but I also think that the most important issue right now amongst the many that are facing the country is what to do about the debt ceiling. And raising that debt ceiling is an obligation that Congress has, and it should be done sooner rather than later. Republicans voted for the CARES Act. That pandemic relief, as I said, was noteworthy because it put cash in the hands of people who needed it. It put vaccines in the arms of people who were in the midst of the worst pandemic in 100 years. And I think that they voted for increased military spending. The military budget has gone up significantly. They've also voted for the infrastructure bill. They voted for the CHIPS Act. And even though they did not vote for the president's rescue package, many of those pieces of legislation, by the way, I was either the primary author or a consequential author of. And the bill is due. Now, the pandemic relief that took place, it had to be done. So I don't understand how they can now say, and by the way, this only happens when there's a Democratic president, that they preach this fiscal probity. So the legislation as it relates to the debt ceiling is a reminder that we still live in a $25 trillion economy here in the United States. We can manage this debt. I think the president's position is correct, and that is that raise the debt ceiling and then we'll negotiate. We all know that we're going to have to negotiate some of these issues. But look, I'm not voting to cut Social Security, I'm not voting to cut Medicare, and I'm not voting to cut Medicaid. And after that, they've got to tell us where they intend to take us with their new majority in the House, which, by the way, is very fractious.
I was trying to think of a time when someone running for Speaker of the House had such a hard time getting elected. And he had a very hard time getting elected. Do you think that some of the deals that Terrence McCarthy made in order to get the votes of some of those members of his own party are now going to affect the kind of legislation that they're going to propose?
There's a fringe element there. Of that, there's no doubt. And of that fringe element, they're the ones that in the end elevated him to the speakership. One of the most important votes you cast in Congress, which generally takes place on Organizational Day, is who's going to be the Speaker of the House. And on our side, it's been a pretty smooth transition for as long as I've been there. And this one was pretty rocky for Speaker McCarthy. I also thought that as he had to make these deals, he had to make them with the far right of the Republican Party. You know, there really aren't any Charlie Bakers in this Republican Party anymore. Even the ones from the Northeast, I think they feel obeisance to this more fringe element that has taken over much of the base of the Republican Party. The challenge always is that you now can win a Republican primary with a fringe candidate. And I think that McCarthy, in his steep climb, I think that what he was looking for was any deal that would elevate him to the speakership. And I think that the agreements that he made with the far right of his own party, I think it's going to pay him back, and he's not going to like the way that it's done eventually.
So let's do a little history here. Certainly you were in Congress when John Boehner was House Speaker.
And a nice guy, by the way.
Well, he had the reputation of being someone who could sit down and have a
very decent
consensus
guy.
and reach a compromise with.
I got to know him very early on, and I'll tell you why. I got elected in '88, he got elected in '90. When you're a new member of Congress, there's not a lot to do some evenings. And we used to play basketball in the house gym, one-on-one. And we befriended each other. And I thought Boehner was a really good guy. And I thought the way he was treated by his own party was pretty harsh in the end, too. Say the same for Paul Ryan. Where I would disagree with Paul Ryan, he was also a thinker.
Well, I was just thinking, you know, Boehner in many ways was handicapped by the fringe of the Republicans in Congress, and I'm wondering if McCarthy's going to also be hobbled the same way.
Well, McCarthy's situation is even more complicated because they accepted in the rules package, it also passes on the first day, this ability now for one member of the Republican Party to question whether or not he ought to remain as Speaker. And that means his standing could be eliminated very fast as Speaker of the House. So he doesn't have much room to maneuver here left or right.
There's a tremendous amount of additional criticism now aimed at President Biden for things like inflation. And I realize that the bottom line is whoever sits in the White House is going to be tarred with a brush that maybe he or she doesn't deserve. In terms of inflation, do you think that any of these accusations toward the Biden administration are credible at all? This concept that the money that Congress voted to help get the nation out of the pandemic,
Which we did.
is somehow responsible for this inflation.
Not true. Is Joe Biden responsible for 10% inflation in the UK? Is he responsible for inflation across Eastern Europe? Is he responsible for inflation in China? Part of this was what happened to the old basics of economics, supply and demand. Clearly, the supply chains became a major problem. Secondly, people were sitting at home for a considerable period of time. When the pandemic seemed to calm, people used the money that had been put in their hands to buy long-needed accessories.
Right.
And I think that the best testimony on this came from the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board but a week ago. He's a Republican. He's what we would have described at one time as a country club Republican. He was very friendly with the Bush family, very friendly with Reagan. He said Biden's not responsible for the inflation. It's the supply chain issue that's responsible for inflation. And the fact that there was this pent-up desire with economic consequence is pretty far-reaching to make it an accusation.
And yet, in the echo chamber, that's what you hear over and over and over.
Well, I can make this argument that because I wrote much of the CARES Act, and I can tell you that we wanted to get money into the hands of people who needed it. This was about food on the table. This was about the utilities being paid monthly for the use of electricity. This was about the idea of making sure that those children had the heat on in the house. So I look back at that, and it should be a proud moment for America. And you know, the media at the beginning, they took the position that we should have been more like China, if you remember. Look at the way the Chinese have handled that. Well, the Chinese vaccines didn't work very well. 6 months ago, they were putting people in jail over the pandemic, beating up people in the streets. We, in America, lost, from the time that Dr. Fauci on March 11th of 2020 offered his warning as to what was coming, we lost in 3 months 22 million jobs. Every one of those jobs has been returned. And right now, there are 11 million vacancies in America, or 2 jobs per unemployed person. So the challenge ought to be a better alignment between skill set, geography, and making sure those people get into the workforce, instead of the argument that we're currently having, that all of a sudden that Biden's policies created this inflationary trend where there's no evidence to really support it.
Another key thing that we keep hearing about is congressional support of Ukraine. And I know that there are people on the right who are somehow believing that our involvement with trying to help Ukraine expel invaders, Russian invaders, is not good policy.
Nothing aided Ronald Reagan's rise to power like his opposition to the Soviet Union and to Russia. His speech in Berlin, if you recall, it called the world's attention to the harshness of the Soviet regime. The Republican Party was unified generally around defense spending and Russia. And now for them to have taken the position that somehow that Putin's actions have been inconsequential. If you live in the Baltics, you're worried about Putin now. The idea that Norway and Sweden are seeking, the idea that Finland and Sweden are seeking NATO representation, the idea that the Swiss are contemplating it. How about the Poles and the Romanians? They're worried about the overreach of Putin and the punitive example that he has set in Ukraine. 3 cheers for Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. They did nothing to deserve this. It is an independent nation, and to have Putin say things like, there's no such place as Ukraine, I mean, that's something you would have expected that the Communist Party would have been saying in the 50s and the 60s as they made things up. So I think that Biden has adopted not only the right posture, but I think he's done a really good job of rallying the world in the cause. NATO looks better than ever, recalling that the former president threatened to take us out of NATO.
Yes.
NATO is an alliance that brought about the demise of Marxism. And what NATO accomplished in Eastern Europe, because of the fortitude of Western Europe and the United States, is pretty remarkable. We can argue about their democracies, but what we can't argue about is they at least now have free elections.
So do you anticipate that there's going to be, number one, more of an ask from Ukraine for more American aid, and will Congress support that?
Yes, I do. I think that. I think Senator McConnell has made clear his continuing support, but he would have been an old-line Cold Warrior as it relates to the old Soviet Union, and he's indicated that he is supportive of the president's position. I'm thinking that this is probably now about 40% of the Republican Party nationwide that has taken this position, but I don't see any threat in Congress. I think that Democrats are united with the president as it relates to Ukraine, and I think that there are enough Republicans, more than half of their caucus is united in their opposition with us to Ukraine, to the Russian actions in Ukraine.
This past 3 or 4 months, we have seen so much evidence of climate change in terms of our weather patterns. It's astonishing. Just this past week, that incredible tornado that hit Mississippi and was on the ground for over an hour, which is amazing and hideous. We've seen California buffeted by a drought, and now they're drowning in floods. Does any of this maybe make members of Congress who are still climate change deniers say, well, wait a minute, something is going on. This is not normal weather patterns. We're seeing now the evidence of true climate change.
I mean, one of the first issues that we all saw internationally, it took place about 15 years ago, and there were the fires in Russia.
Right.
I mean, pretty extraordinary what was happening. You couldn't put those fires out. And I think that that was one of the first moments when people saw evidence clearly as to what was happening. But back to the Inflation Reduction Act, $369 billion worth of tax credits, the promotion of the use of electric vehicles, EVs, taken, I think, to its manifestation. It will allow the average American consumer to do a more effective job of reducing the carbon footprint in their own lives. I think here that the rest of the world is rallying to the United States position, but there are the deniers in Congress who question the science of global warming.
Right.
I'm not sure they really believe it, but I think for economic reasons in some parts of the country, they accept it. So again, back to Inflation Reduction Act, this is where we want to travel as we go forward.
I know that you're a guy whose congressional career, this is not an insult when I say traditional. You're a guy who sits down and talks to guys on the other side of the aisle. Okay, so we have a problem, we need to get a solution, and you work it out. And I know in the past when we've sat in these chairs and talked, you've spoken about the changes.
Yeah, dramatic.
Are you seeing any progress now to get back to the old style, or is it going in that other direction harder?
I think for people who are earnest and serious about legislating, people who know where amendments go, people who know how to sit in a room for a long time and embrace what we call the regular order, they're still the ones that America relies upon. We're not the ones that are on cable TV shows every night largely because we turned down the invitations. We are not the ones that are bombarding social media with these narrow opinions that evaporate the next day. And when you look back at what we did with the CARES Act, I'm very proud of it. Speaker Pelosi and I and Secretary Mnuchin, in 8 days, day in and day out with professional tax staff and others, we were able to write that legislation. It unanimously passed. USMCA, the largest trade agreement in the history of the world. The former president said he's going to take us out of it. I didn't favor NAFTA, but I knew this, once we were in, we couldn't walk away from it.
Right.
And led the negotiations there with a Republican administration. And at the same time, when the president's rescue package was put forward, I led that very consequential legislation. When the president's infrastructure bill, all those tax credits come from the Ways and Means Committee. When you look at the CHIPS Act, the tax provisions in there came from the Ways and Means Committee. Where I could find help on the other side, I did. And I reached out to Republicans who I thought might be interested in what the final package looked like. You now have the phenomena of probably 25 years of large numbers of people who got elected to Congress because they ran against Congress.
Right.
They made it very hard for themselves once they got there. And I think the other challenge we have now, it's many times the people with the safest congressional districts. As Speaker Pelosi recently said, in some of these districts, if you put D on a coffee cup, it's going to win. They're the ones that refuse to take some of these negotiating positions because they're concerned about a primary back home. And I think that the better position here is to go back and demonstrate your wares, talk about the legislative achievements that you've had that have been most significant as I've described them, and be prepared to take the primary if you have to. I think the merits of the arguments still count. I think the consequence of the legislation still counts. You change lives through legislation. The Affordable Care Act, 13 years in, 40 more million Americans have health insurance because of the Affordable Care Act. I played a major role in helping to get that over the goal line. We knew what we could pass and what we couldn't pass.
Right.
And we passed what we could pass, and it's worked really well. We're going to keep upgrading it. It's becoming much more popular with the American people. And all of that talk at the time of repeal and replace, Republicans have never agreed amongst themselves about health insurance, never mind agreeing with us on it. But I think your point is well taken. And the other issue that I know you've been interested in because you write long pieces, reporters used to be able to do context.
Right.
They would explain why Chairman Neal did this, why Chairman Neal didn't do that. And it was kind of the inside game, as we would call it. But it gave, I think, voters and the citizenry some comfort as to the fact that it was actually adults who were negotiating these monumental pieces of legislation. I mean, if you look back at how Lyndon Johnson sold the Civil Rights Act of '64, how he sold the Voting Rights Act, how about Medicare, Medicaid, and the Wilderness Act? But when you study how that was done, and look, I've been a devotee of the history of the Ways and Means Committee. I've served with Republican chairman and Democratic chairman and been chairman. I know who we generally can get in big moments. USMCA passed the Ways and Means Committee with only one dissenter. CARES Act entirely. How about Secure 2.0 for retirement purposes? Secure. Unanimously passed the Ways and Means Committee. The vote in the House of Representatives on that retirement package that I'm the primary or principal author of, 430 to 5? I mean, I think that in these instances, there's a rhythm to legislating. And I think you've described it perfectly. If you're always going to stand outside and say, I can never be part of the solution because it'll be treasonous, then you're going to continue with the stalemate.
I don't know about you, but every time I turn on the news and I see another story about a school shooting, we just had one in Nashville. I was reading quotes from, I believe, the congressman who represents where the district where that school is, and he's talking about, well, we don't need more gun control, we need more mental health screenings and programs. Do you think we're ever going to come to some sort of common sense about things like assault rifles, about how guns are bought and sold and stored, and who should have them and who shouldn't have them?
For all the talk about the crime bill, you know, that Bill Clinton helped to author, we banned assault weapons in that bill.
Right.
I mean, I think people cherry pick parts of that legislation. I've been a consistent supporter of making sure that we keep weapons out of hands of people who are mentally ill, people who are spousal abusers, and I don't understand for the life of me why we can't do mental health background checks, why we can't do some of the more modest things. I think that the pundits usually say that Democrats blame guns and Republicans blame people. And I think that that's an easy effort to surmise. But consequential legislation makes the most sense here. We're not talking about taking away the guns of sportsmen, taking away the guns of legitimate gun collectors. But what happened but an hour from here with those children in Connecticut, I mean, those are the consequences of the inaction as it relates to some measures that would take these guns out of the hands of people who mean great harm.
Well, you know, during President Obama's tenure, I kept having people say to me, well, you know, he's going to take my guns away from me. And I would say, okay, he's been in office 2 terms. What guns has he taken away from anyone? Can you point to an action where the President of the United States ordered law enforcement to confiscate weapons from anybody? Right. But it's this talking point that doesn't seem to want to die.
Well, it's a good one for fundraising on the other side, too. And the NRA has made it clear that they depend upon a lot of campaign contributions. And they make far-reaching arguments, and I'll repeat, I have no interest in taking the guns away from hunters that are licensed. No idea that I want to take away the guns of the collectors. But I do think minimal standards, mental health background checks. I mean, you don't get a learner's permit. You can't get a driver's license.
Right.
But in these instances here, as recently as what happened in Tennessee, she owned 8 guns that she had recently purchased.
You have an anniversary coming up on Good Friday that is very significant to you, and it relates to peace in Ireland. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that for a moment.
Well, I think the American dimension to the Good Friday Agreement has now been able to stand under the magnifying glass of critical analysis during these 25 years. As I reminded the British Secretary of State 2 weeks ago in my office, and as recently as a member of the Chancellor of the Exchequer this past week, for 25 years this agreement has held. There were 30,000 British soldiers in an area the size of the state of Connecticut. And everywhere you went, there were watchtowers. It was a militarized state. You couldn't travel. I was on a bus with the Speaker of the House in 1989, Speaker Foley. And the bus was stopped at the Donegal dairy border, searched by soldiers in night vision rather, and heavy armaments with the Speaker of the House. And my point is today, if you cross that alleged border, your phone pings. That's all that happens. You can travel anywhere you want. Everybody, Mike, had to give up something to get to the Good Friday Agreement. The Republic of Ireland gave up Articles 2 and 3 of its constitution, which laid claim to the North, and the UK gave up the border. So today, you travel from Belfast to Dublin, back and forth. The border is open, and I think that the real achievement here will be when we're able to say that we're not talking about 2 communities, but we're talking about 2 traditions that live in one community. I don't know anybody who would say that we should leave the Good Friday Agreement, that's for sure. And it's heralded as a major part of American foreign policy. And again, without the American dimension, as an honest broker, it would never have happened. And my role here, I started, as you might recall, when I was a young member of the City Council in Springfield. I was highly critical of what the UK government was doing as it related to those military funerals that the IRA wanted. Mm-hmm. And the fact that those caskets were turned around, it had a major impact across America because every night that the media was there to witness what was happening. So if you travel again today, there are no British soldiers. The police force has been fully integrated, and people in government at Stormont may not love each other yet, but we're still trying to keep them sitting in government where they might get onto the mundane obligations of day-to-day governance.
Do you think that there will be the day where there will be no distinctions between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland?
Well, the genius of the Good Friday Agreement is that if you want to be Irish, you can be Irish. If you want to be British, you can be British. And now there's a new identity that's taking place called Northern Irish. There is in the Good Friday Agreement what is known as a principle of consent, that the Secretary of State can call an election on a united Ireland, and I think now you're going to see over the next 10 years a pretty good campaign on all sides to deliberate the future of what those 6 counties are going to look like. But the great part about it is you're not going to bomb anybody into a united Ireland. You're not going to scare them into a united Ireland. They need to be convinced. And I've continued to meet with all the political parties. I saw them recently in Washington. I've known them for a long period of time. And this is a moment to acknowledge that people in both traditions took great risks to get to this day. It's always easy for one side to say the other side should give this up or give that up. The hard part is getting your own most sincere and adamant followers to understand, well, this is an advance, but you're not going to get today everything that you want.
Right.
And one of the hardest things in politics is to tell your most fervent supporters you disagree.
Well, I was very curious about this. My wife is Scottish, born and raised until she was 13 in Glasgow. And the new First Minister of Scotland is calling again for a referendum for independence. And I think this time it will actually pass. And so there's interesting parallels between Scottish independence and Irish union, so to speak.
Well, Brexit complicated all of this too, because the Scots voted to stay in European Union, and the North of Ireland voted to stay in European Union. So Brexit, as you know, compounded everything, and it also structured, I think, a more ferocious identity. And the Scots, as you know, since the Act of Union, there's been a pretty good formation there of Scottish nationalism in a beautiful country, by the way.
I agree.
And to see Glasgow, it's really a spectacular setting. So I'm not sure when that's going to happen again. I have met the first ministers in the past, and it strikes me that that the Scottish independence position it's going to continue.
Well, sir, I want to thank you very much for coming in again and providing us with much needed context and analysis of what's going on. And folks, you've been watching another edition of Government Matters. Thanks for tuning in.